3 in the morning, a trench somewhere in northern France, 1918. Most of the men are asleep or lying there pretending to be, because real sleep doesn't come easy out here. The night's gone quiet. After weeks in this spot, quiet doesn't mean safe anymore. It just means nobody's shooting yet. Then a small brown and white dog loses his mind, barking, snapping at sleeves, yanking on collars, refusing to shut up no matter how many half-asleep soldiers try to shove him off. And then one of them catches it, that faint, almost sweet smell drifting low along the trench floor. Chlorine gas, invisible in the dark, sinking into the low ground exactly where they're all standing and moving fast. By the time a human nose picks that up, you're already in trouble. This dog caught it minutes earlier. For us, an early warning is a buzz on your phone. For the men crammed into that trench, the gap between living and dying by slow chemical suffocation sometimes came down to whether a stray dog decided you were worth waking up. His name was Stubby, and by the end of the war, he'd become the most decorated dog in American military history. To understand how any of this happened, you have to go back a full year before that trench, to the summer of 1917, on a training field at Yale University in New Haven, Connecticut. The 102nd Infantry Regiment was in the middle of basic training there, drilling on the field day after day, when a small stray dog started hanging around the edges of the formations. Nobody knows exactly where he came from. No collar, no tags, just a stocky little bull terrier mix with a short, stubby tail that immediately gave him his name. He wasn't shy about it either. He'd wander in among the marching soldiers, sit and watch the drills, and gradually start attaching himself to one man in particular, a corporal named James Robert Conroy. Conroy started feeding him, then sneaking him into the barracks after lights out, then, without really planning to, became his owner. And Stubby, for his part, seemed to actually understand what was happening around him. Soldiers later swore he picked up the bugle calls faster than some of the new recruits did, reacting to reveille, mess call, and lights out like he'd been enlisted himself. Here's the detail that really sold the men on him, though. Stubby taught himself, just from watching the men salute their officers day after day, to sit up on his hind legs and lift a front paw to his eyebrow in a passable imitation of a salute. It wasn't trained into him. Nobody sat him down and drilled it. He just picked it up from repetition, the same way he'd picked up the bugle calls, and it was good enough that it became his signature party trick. That trick is almost certainly the only reason he made it to France at all. When the 102nd got their orders to ship out from Newport News, Virginia, dogs obviously weren't allowed on a military transport, so Conroy smuggled him aboard, hidden inside his own overcoat, holding him tight and praying he wouldn't decide to bark at exactly the wrong moment while they filed past the officers checking manifests at the gangplank. It worked, right up until it didn't. A few days into the crossing, an officer discovered him, and this is the moment the whole story could have ended. A stowaway dog, tossed off at the next port, forgotten. Instead, Conroy had Stubby perform his salute right there on the deck in front of the discovering officer. And the officer, apparently completely charmed, decided a dog who could salute deserved to stay. Stubby wasn't quietly tolerated after that. He was led onto the ship's official roster as a mascot with the commanding officer's blessing. By the time they landed in France, he wasn't a secret anymore. He was already, unofficially, part of the regiment. You can't understand why a dog mattered this much without understanding what trench warfare was actually like. It wasn't just bullets. It was a handful of specific, constant ways to die, all happening at once. Gas was the one nobody could see coming. Chlorine, phosgene, mustard. By 1918, it was routine. Gas is heavier than air, so it doesn't drift. It pools right at ground level, right where the trenches sat. Masks worked fine if you got them on fast enough. The problem was always the fast enough part. A dog's nose is somewhere around 10,000 times more sensitive than a human's. That's not a fun trivia fact when you're the one sleeping in a trench. That's the whole ball game. Then there was the shelling, which for long stretches never really stopped. Soldiers learned to read the pitch of an incoming shell to guess how close it would land, but that trick bought you maybe a second or two. A lot of the deaths out there weren't even direct hits. It was collapsing walls, flying debris, the sheer concussion of it all. And underneath all of that, quietly killing people just as effectively, was the trench itself. Standing water, packed mud, rats everywhere. Trench foot could take a man's leg. Infected wounds killed almost as reliably as artillery did, especially if nobody found you in time after you went down. Gas, shelling, and just the trench doing what trenches do. That was Tuesday. Once Stubby's gas warnings and shell instincts had already made him essential, he did something that turned him from useful mascot into a genuine wartime legend, and it happened in the Argonne, during a lull between major engagements. No Man's Land wasn't just a killing field between assaults, it was also crawling, quietly, with something both sides depended on constantly: intelligence gathering. German soldiers would regularly attempt to slip across the broken, cratered ground between the lines at night, working their way close enough to American trenches to sketch out troop positions, count machine gun placements, and map exactly where the weak points in the line were. If that information made it back to German command, it could shape where the next bombardment or assault landed, and how many Americans died in it. One night, one of these men made it further than most. He'd crossed no man's land undetected, gotten past the forward listening posts, and was moving through the American trench itself, close enough to touch the men he was spying on, sketching positions in the dark. Stubby found him first. Accounts differ slightly on the exact mechanics, but the outcome is consistent across every version. Stubby went after the infiltrator, caught him from behind, and clamped down, most accounts say specifically on the seat of his pants, and simply refused to let go. The German soldier, caught completely off guard by a dog materializing out of the darkness, couldn't shake him loose or fight him off quietly without drawing attention, which was exactly the problem for him, because drawing attention was the last thing an infiltrator wants. His struggling and the commotion alerted nearby soldiers, who arrived to find Stubby still latched on, effectively holding a fully grown enemy soldier in place by himself until he could be taken prisoner. A dog, alone, in the dark, had done what an entire section of sentries had failed to do: stopped an enemy spy in the act, inside their own lines. The regiment didn't let that go unnoticed. Word of it moved up the chain, and Stubby was given a formal promotion to the rank of sergeant, an honor that technically put him one rank above Conroy, the corporal who'd smuggled him onto the ship in the first place. From that point forward, he wasn't just the mascot to the men around him. He was Sergeant Stubby, and he'd earned it the same way anyone else in that trench had, by doing something that mattered when it counted. Between bombardments, trenches were mostly just long, miserable stretches of waiting. And that's where Stubby's usefulness kept growing. He'd go out into no man's land after an attack and track down wounded men by scent. Soldiers who'd gone down and couldn't call out, buried under debris or too far gone to shout for a medic. He'd find them and just stay there, barking until stretcher bearers showed up. He also just made the rounds, moved from trench to trench, let exhausted men fuss over him for a few minutes, gave them something warm and alive to focus on that wasn't casualty counts or the next barrage schedule. Over 18 months at the front, he lived through 4 major offensives and 17 battles. He was hit by shrapnel. He got gassed himself, badly enough to need recovery time, and then he went right back to the line. At some point, the soldiers made him a little chamois coat, and over the following months, it filled up with medals and ribbons and pins, one for every engagement he made it through. It turned him into something like a walking scrapbook of the unit's whole war, and telling his story, explaining what each new medal meant, gave men something to talk about that wasn't just how many people they'd lost that week. That didn't stop when the fighting did. Stubby came home to a level of fame that's honestly kind of absurd for a stray from a Connecticut parking lot. He met President Wilson, later Coolidge and Harding. He marched in parades. He became an honorary member of the American Legion and the Red Cross, and war correspondents wrote him up constantly, turning his story into one of the most talked about animal narratives to come out of the entire war. There's something almost obvious about why, in hindsight. World War I killed people in numbers so large they stopped feeling like individual deaths, just statistics, casualty lists, blocks of names. Stubby was the opposite of that. He was one specific, scruffy, very real presence that people could actually attach a story to. In a war built on scale and anonymity, that mattered more than it probably should have. Stubby died in 1926. He's still around, technically, preserved, and on display at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, where a small, scruffy dog with no pedigree and no formal training still gets remembered as one of the most decorated soldiers of the entire First World War, of any species.